Hello, I'm Meri Fatin and welcome to Cover to Cover. On this program we discuss great new West Australian books. The show is presented by Writing WA, the peak body for writing and related activities in Western Australia. My guest today is Susan Midalia. Susan is a writer and freelance editor who also conducts workshops on short story writing. Today we're discussing her third collection of short stories, Feet to the Stars. Welcome Susan, thanks for being here.
Thank you Meri, it's a pleasure.
Looking through the book as a body of work, I was really struck by the diversity of characters and situations in it. Tell me a little bit about what you set out to do with this book.
That was a deliberate, quite self-conscious decision. I wanted to write about a range of different characters. Character is my main interest in short story writing. So I have stories told from the perspective of males as well as females, from working class characters, middle class characters, teenagers as well as adults. And I did that partly because it's fun. It's actually enormously pleasurable to pretend to be someone else, someone who's very different from me. And also because as a writer and indeed as a person, I think it's important to try to understand other people because with understanding, I think you come sympathy rather than judgment. So I call these stories acts of the empathetic imagination, that they're, so there is a kind of moral purpose behind them, if you like. But it's also, it is also fun. It's like ventriloquizing other people.
So what are the challenges then of creating characters that are outside of the realm of your experience?
With working class characters, because I'm educated middle class woman, with working class characters the challenge is not to be patronising, not to turn them into kind of caricatures. Sometimes there's this tendency, and some middle class writers do it, to create working class characters who are kind of salt of the earth type, not very smart, but decent people. So I wanted to get away from that kind of stereotype. What else is a challenge? It's was a challenge writing from the perspective of male characters. So I have one male character who's very cynical, very grumpy, another one who's actually quite hopeful, but Initially, I thought it would be difficult, but in the end, I thought, well, I like to think that men and women have more in common than there are differences. You know that there's this book that made heaps of money called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, and I'd like to write the sequel, which is Men Are From Earth, Women Are From Earth. Get used to it.
Yeah.
I don't think there are differences, but I think the commonalities are more important. Yeah.
I want to ask you about a couple of the stories in the book more specifically. Firstly, the first story, The Hook, which comes out of a personal experience of a trip to Ellis Island. Tell me a bit about that.
It is partly autobiographical. So about 4 years ago now, my husband and I took a trip to New York, and one of the things we did was go to the museum. It's now a museum off the coast, so you sail past the Statue of Liberty and you go to Ellis Island. And Ellis Island used to be an immigration processing centre for many, many years. Hundreds of thousands of people came there, and now it's a museum, so you can go in and see all the images, watch all the videos, read the texts. And when we went, I found it overwhelming. There's so many stories of suffering and deprivation, as well as resilience and hope. But there's so much material. It's hard to take it all in. But I decided that I wanted to write about it, that I needed to write about it, and partly I think because I come from migrant parents myself, and my parents came from Europe in 1949. But when I tried to write the story, every time I tried to write it, it didn't work. It sounded cliched, predictable, just unconvincing. And I tried about 6 or 7 times, and in the end, what I did with the story was have the 2 main characters taking the trip to Ellis Island and talking about what they will find there, but I never actually. The story ends as they land on the island.
Except for the hook.
Well, I do give some, yes, okay, thank you for reminding me what's in my story. The title, The Hook, it comes from, the hook is the like a button hook that was used by the doctors on the island to open up the eye, or to lift the eyelid of the immigrants as they came on shore, because they were checking for trachoma and other diseases of the eye. And there was something about the indignity of that and the kind of humiliation of that. And the immigrants themselves said that the doctors who did this, used this hook, were the most feared people on the island. And part of the reason that's such a compelling symbol, I guess, is that if any disease was found, within seconds the immigrants would be sent back to where they came from. So they'd made this huge journey from the other side of the world. Sometimes it took them weeks, sometimes months, and then in 10 seconds their fate would be decided. Yeah, but it's something about the hook, which is physically so tiny, I could use in the story as a symbol for much larger things, for the humiliation, the cruelty, the indignity, all those things. And I think that's what writers often do. They use a detail to stand in for something much bigger.
I also wanted to ask you about a story called Working It Out, because I really loved your light touch around, I guess, the indifference that can develop in a long-term relationship between the 2 people. Tell me a little bit more about that story.
Working It Out is, it's quite a bleak story, I think, because, it is about the not untypical experience, I guess, of a marriage which begins with passion, but over the years becomes, it's a story, I think, about the sadness of what could have been, but the marriage itself didn't actually start well, in the sense that it was what used to be called a shotgun wedding. But that's one of the bleaker stories in the collection, I think, because he's such the male character, who's the perspective of the story, is so cynical, so jaded.
But it's still a beautiful story. I have to personally recommend it, even though you say it's one of the bleaker ones. You said to me when we spoke before that one of the least interesting questions for you is around, how autobiographical your stories are. And I know that you've made a distinct effort to step away from your own experience, and yet I'm interested in how your life experiences still do kind of appear. And so I have to ask you about self-reflexivity and other stuff. Tell me a little bit about that story.
Okay, yes, that is autobiographical. So self-reflexivity and other stuff is the title. Comes out of my experience of teaching creative writing, and I do a lot of it, but this one particular experience I had, and I won't name where it was, I found intensely disillusioning in that the people who came to the workshops was a huge class. They were predominantly quite young, and now I'm going to sound like a grumpy old woman, but most of them didn't read, weren't interested in reading. And I always say to people who are interested in writing, if you take your writing seriously, then you must be a reader, because you can learn so much from reading good fiction.
I love that bit in the story where the response to that was, but it might contaminate my ideas.
That's right. Oh, I never read. She says it destroys my creativity, and And I have so it's told from the perspective of the creative writing teacher, who's also very jaded and cynical and fed up with the world, and who has had her own unhappiness. But I have heard her lecturing the students, haranguing them at one stage, saying, you know, have some humility for God's sake. You're 17, you know nothing, you've experienced nothing, you've read nothing, and you want to write. So she goes into a rant, which is something you can do when you create a character. You can have them rant rather than ranting yourself. My husband knows I'm a ranter. You know, in front of the TV I get very cross and angry, but you can't do that in fiction. You can't impose your own views, particularly your political views, on readers. So I kind of cheat and have characters do it for me.
And through the characters. You mentioned that you really like to explore character in stories, but also you've mentioned empathy and connection, and I think that that's something else that comes through in every single one of them. What's your intent with that? You know, as a writer, what do you want to be able to deliver to the reader?
I want readers to feel empathetic, I think, towards characters, because that translates into your own experience with people in real life. I don't think, by and large, I don't think reading necessarily makes you a better person, and I don't think reading necessarily changes your life. But what it can do is encourage readers to reflect on who they are, how they treat other people. For me, that question, how do you treat someone else, is probably the most important, or one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves. So in asking readers to understand characters rather than to judge them, judgment is the easy response, understanding's much more difficult. So that's the kind of thing I've tried to do. Yeah, and it's an act of the imagination, imagining what it's like to be someone who's not you. It's very hard to get outside our own heads.
And you also said to me that you're a big believer in hope. I was hoping you could expand on that a bit.
I think we have to have hope. There's a wonderful quote by Oscar Wilde, where he's got many wonderful quotes, but this is, we're all of us born in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. And I love that idea that we're all mired in the negative things. We're all mired in the muck of life, the hatred, the prejudice, the bigotry, but we can also look up at the stars and have hope. I mean, to be political at this point, many of the asylum seekers in detention centres have given up hope. And if you were really cynical, you could say that's a deliberate strategy, that this is how you reduce people. This is how you make them feel that they're not worth anything. You strip away hope. So for me, hope is hope has an ethical dimension. It's about hope to me is tied up with questions of justice and treating people with respect. So so it's a serious business. Hope, I think, if it's what totalitarian regimes do. They strip away hope from people, because if you don't have a sense that the future might be different, you don't feel the need for change. You just resign yourself to a terrible presence. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you also, before I would like to explore the idea of writing a short story in more depth, but before I do that, are there any kinds of characters, any certain backgrounds of characters that you wouldn't be comfortable writing?
I wouldn't presume to write from the perspective of an Indigenous person, because I don't think I could imagine that. Well, to me, it would seem presumptuous to pretend to be an Indigenous person.
So does that mean an Indigenous person of any Indigenous race, or just an
Australian Aborigines, but also people from a culture or a race that's I guess it has a lot to do with I don't think I could imagine what it's like to be subjected every day to insult, to degradation, I couldn't imagine what it's like to have your culture destroyed. And I'm not suggesting by that Indigenous people are always victims. That's not the case. But I just feel that experience is so far removed from mine, and it would be. I don't think I could speak for those people. I would feel that's presumptuous of me. It's like ethically presumptuous. I have no right to do that, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I understand. I am really keen to explore the art of short story writing with you, and you said to me how short stories pay tribute to the value of the moments in our lives. Talk to me a bit more about that.
Yeah, and I think that's what short stories do. That's partly why I love writing them, that they remind us that we live our life in moments in time. So we experience and we understand our life as a sequence of events that unfolds over time, and that's what novels write about. But short stories remind us that we also experience our life in moments, and that moments can be profound. They can be haunting. One of my stories, actually in my second collection, is based on an experience I had 40 years ago, and it stayed with me. Just this one moment in time where one thing was said, and so moments can be turning points, crises, revelations. They can be transforming. They can change your life in a moment, or they can be intensely disillusioning. So that's one of the reasons I love writing them. That you can kind of crystallize a moment or moments in stories. That I guess what I'd want to say is that sometimes people think that short stories are superficial as compared to novels, and my answer to that is, well, there's nothing superficial about a moment in time that you can it can evoke so much. It can resonate with several meanings, many meanings.
And also where you talked about the hook before, and how something like that can be so symbolic of something much larger, and about the economies and the need to be concise in a short story. That there's a real methodology to writing a great short story that's quite different to writing a novel. I think it's actually, well, in my experience, writing a short story that I'm reasonably happy with, that because it's never perfect, but it's difficult. It's actually difficult it's enormously pleasurable. I love the difficulty, but it's a challenge because you have to be relatively brief, economical, but you want the story to resonate. So it is about wanting to be both brief but not superficial, and that's difficult, I think. Are they necessarily inconclusive because they're short?
No, that's a good question. That's a tricky question. Some short stories can end with some kind of resolution, but my stories typically don't. They end in an open-ended way, and that's partly because I think you want to leave the reader with imagining perhaps what might happen or what could happen, and because life's like that. That's what short stories remind us, that life is inconclusive. It's what we know is always provisional. I think what readers like about novels, or certain kinds of novels anyway, is that they they resolve something. They whereas short stories often, they don't do that.
They're more of an observation.
Yeah, and they raise questions. I'm not saying novels don't raise questions. Of course they do. But short stories and novels give readers different kinds of pleasures, different kinds of satisfaction, if you like. Yeah.
And although you've built your reputation around the art of the short story, you have attempted a novel, haven't you?
I've attempted 2.
Yeah.
Both of which were spectacularly unsuccessful.
But why were they? Why didn't it work for you?
Look, I look back on the first one now, Meri, and I think, what was I thinking? It's not a lot, actually. Well, just very, very fundamental things. This is embarrassing.
I don't want to embarrass you.
No. It's just, I rushed in because I had what I thought was a great idea. And so I didn't, for example, keep a timeline. And it was only when I'd finished it that I discovered I had a character who'd been pregnant for 18 months. So I wasn't writing science fiction either. So those kinds of, literal things. But also I didn't know how to, how you structure it and how you fit all the pieces together. So nothing really cohered. It was a bit of a mess.
So then I won't embarrass you further
That's
by
all right.
asking further questions on that. Let's talk about the successful things. But short story writing in Australia is how is the scene for short story writers here?
It's actually getting better. I think for some time in Australian literary culture, the short story hasn't been particularly valued, or you might say it's been undervalued. If you measure that by sales, if you measure that by what publishers are prepared to publish. But I think it's, whereas in, say, in America, in the UK, in countries in Europe, short story is really prized. And in some cases, short stories are considered more valuable than novels, collections of short stories. But I think it's getting better in Australia. In the last 5-6 years, there's actually been a real flourishing of single author collections. It's wonderful to see, both from established writers and debut writers, emerging writers. So it's terrific. I think people are starting to, publishers in particular are now willing to take a risk. They used to say, oh no, don't publish short stories. They don't sell. But I think that's changing.
What did that feel like, to be told that?
Well, I was very lucky, very fortunate in that my publisher, UWA Publishing, who published all 3 of my collections, the director, Terry Ann White, is a great fan of the short story. It's her favourite genre. So she was very receptive to publishing a collection and has continued to publish me. But really, for a long time in Australia, unless you were a big name writer, David Malouf or Tim Winton, it was difficult to get a collection published.
Well, speaking of West Australian publications, I always ask for a recommendation of another West Australian author, and you've recommended Lucy Dugan, the poet.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about The Guardians.
The Guardians. This is Lucy's 4th collection of poems. I think she's a very fine poet. The Guardians is, it's about family, it's about illness, it's about place, inheritance, and Lucy's a very, she's very, how can I put this? The stories work at 2 levels. They're both, I think they're very intelligent poems. Sorry, not stories. They're very intelligent poems, but they also affect your emotions as well. And they're much more complex, I think, than they might first appear. That they're very accessible, and this is how I think about my own writing too. That it's accessible. It's not, so difficult that it's impenetrable, and that's how some people think about poetry. Oh no, it's too hard, don't understand it. But Lucy's poetry is very accessible, but it's also very complex. So the more you read them, the more you discover, which is what I want to in my writing. So.
And you were telling me, I was interested because you told me that Dorothy Hewitt was one of your lecturers at UWA.
Yes.
And then that Lucy is related to her.
Yeah, Lucy is Dorothy Hewitt's niece. So Lucy's mum and Dorothy were sisters, and yes, Dorothy Hewitt was my first tutor at university. I was 17 and knew nothing, and Dorothy was this very theatrical, very flamboyant, larger-than-life woman who, I remember she used to sit in the tutorial room smoking, constantly smoking, and we would watch the ash on her cigarette getting longer and longer and longer because she loved to dramatise. And also she invited all her students to parties, and this was, my first experience of a university party, which, mostly consisted of people getting drunk and having drunken conversations. But I thought all this was very glamorous and exciting.
It's all about your development as a creative.
Well, no, I didn't aspire to be. I had no creative aspirations until my 50s. I didn't actually start writing fiction until my 50s, when I knew I wanted to write, and I quit my job. And I have this creature called a patron, my husband, who goes out and earns the money so I can sit at home all day and write. And I feel very privileged because I know most writers have a day job and they have to snatch time, whereas I can sit down all day, 5 days a week, and write.
Well, we're very grateful to your patron too. Thank you so much. It's a beautiful collection of stories, Feet to the Stars, and thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thank you. Great pleasure.
We've created book club notes for Feet to the Stars to prompt a great discussion in your book clubs. The notes are in the For Readers section of our website. If you'd like to receive them directly to your inbox each month, then subscribe to our book club e-newsletter. We understand that many viewers don't have a local bookshop where they can purchase the books we discuss on Cover to Cover. In that case, you can buy them via Crow Books in Perth. Place your order by phone, mention the code Cover to Cover, and you'll get the postage free. Next month on Cover to Cover, I'll meet Kylie Bullough. Kylie is a senior orangutan keeper at Perth Zoo and conservation project manager of the Orangutan Project. Her book, Reaching for the Canopy, tells the remarkable story of the return of an orangutan born in Perth Zoo to the wild, a groundbreaking initiative that many experts believed was doomed to failure. Remember that we love to get your feedback about Cover to Cover. If you have feedback, questions or suggestions, then you can contact Writing WA via the email address shown on the screen or using the information on our website. Thanks for joining me. Enjoy reading local and see you next time.